Clara had always believed that love was enough. When she married Eduardo, she swore to herself that she would do everything to make them happy. And for a while they were. They lived in a beautiful apartment in the city center, traveled together, made plans, and laughed for no apparent reason. He made her feel safe, as if nothing in the world could break that bond. But the truth was that love was not always enough. As the years went by, Eduardo began to change. At first, it was just small things, frequent delays, lame excuses about endless meetings, messages read and not answered. But Clara tried not to think the worst. He was just busy, right? Work demanded a lot from him, and she always wanted to be the understanding wife, the one who trusted, who didn't smother. But deep down, something inside her whispered that something was wrong. That night, Clara decided to do something special. She cooked his favorite dish, chose a good wine, and set the table with care. She lit candles, put on soft music, and wore the blue dress that Eduardo had praised so much. She wanted it to be a memorable night, a good memory in the midst of her tiring routine. The clock read 8:30 p.m. when she sent the first message. "Are you coming?" Nothing. Another half hour passed. She called. Voicemail. 9:45 p.m. The food was already starting to get cold. Clara tried to distract herself, but the silence in the apartment seemed greater than ever. 10:15 p.m. Her chest tightened. She tried to convince herself that she was exaggerating. Maybe Eduardo would walk through the door at any moment with his usual smile and an acceptable explanation. But he didn't. At 11 p.m., the phone finally vibrated. His name flashed on the screen, and Clara answered on the first ring, feeling relief mixed with anxiety. Eduardo. On the other end, a heavy silence, followed by a sigh. "Clara, we need to talk." The words made her heart race. Her hand shook as she gripped the phone tightly. "What happened? Are you okay?" Another silence. Then, the sentence that would make her lose her ground. "I won't be able to go home tonight." That was when Clara knew. She didn't need any more explanations. The hesitant tone, the pause that was too long. Everything said what he didn't have the courage to say. "Where are you?" His voice came out shaky, almost a whisper. On the other end of the line, Clara heard something. A muffled noise, feminine laughter, music in the background, and then the sentence that destroyed any hope. "Honey, are you coming or not?" Her chest froze. The phone almost slipped from her hand. "Who is this?" she asked, feeling her throat tighten. Eduardo's silence said it all. And then he hung up. Clara stood still, staring at the phone, as if she hadn't understood what had just happened. She tried calling again. Voicemail. She sent messages. No answer. The two blue ticks appeared on the screen. He saw it. He read it, and simply ignored her. Clara's world fell apart there, in that room lit only by the flickering light of the candles that had been lit for a special night. A night that never happened. And deep down, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Clara stood there, motionless, holding the phone so tightly that her fingers turned white. Her mind was spinning, trying to find any explanation other than the obvious one. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe Eduardo would call back, laughing, saying it was all a mistake. But the truth was already out in the open. She stood up slowly, as if her feet no longer knew where to go. She walked to the window, gasping for air. But all she found was a pale, lost reflection in the glass. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to rip out of her chest. The night wore on, and Eduardo remained silent. Every minute that passed without a response was a blow, a cruel reminder that he didn't even bother to make up an excuse. When the clock struck 6 in the morning, the door opened. Eduardo walked in slowly, wearing the same clothes as the night before, his hair messy, the strong smell of perfume mixed with alcohol. He stopped when he saw her there, sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on him. For a moment, he seemed surprised. "Clara!" She stood up slowly, feeling her blood boil. "Don't even bother, Eduardo. I already know." He ran his hand over his face, exhausted. "Look, I don't want to argue right now. I have a headache." Clara's laugh came out without her noticing. It was a bitter, incredulous laugh. "Headache? You disappear all night. You don't answer my calls. You ignore me. And now you say you don't want to argue because you're hungover." Eduardo sighed, impatient. "Clara, I don't think it makes sense for us to continue like this anymore." The ground disappeared beneath his feet. "What?" He looked away, running his hand over the back of his neck. "You know, it's been a while since we've been together. Maybe it's better for each of us to go our separate ways. I'm happy like this, and I think you need to find your happiness too." Clara felt her face burn as if she had been slapped. She looked around at the apartment they had built together, at the table still set with the dinner she had prepared with such care, at everything that was now nothing more than the remains of a dream she had sustained alone. She took a deep breath. If she stayed there, begging for answers, for a reason to stay, it would be worse. Without saying anything else, she went upstairs, opened the closet, and began to throw her clothes into the suitcase. Eduardo stood in the living room, confused, still dazed from the drink from the night before. "What are you doing?" She turned to him, her eyes full of tears, but her voice firm. "What does it look like?" "I'm leaving." He frowned, trying to understand. "Clara, let's talk later. I need to get some sleep, then we'll sort this out." But when he woke up, Clara was no longer there. Clara didn't look back. She left the apartment before the sun. Even Rose, with her suitcase dragging along the asphalt and a crushing weight on her chest. The cold morning air mixed with the hot tears that ran down her face, but she didn't let the pain stop her. She had no clear destination. She only knew that she couldn't stay there any longer, in the place where her life had been destroyed in a single night. She took a taxi, not knowing where to go. The driver asked her where to go, and the only thing she could say was, "Just drive." The car drove through the city streets, while Clara tried to control the sobs that threatened to escape. Every corner of that city was a reminder of what she had lost, of the plans she had made with Eduardo, of the dreams that now seemed ridiculous. When the sun was already high, Clara checked into a simple hotel, far from everything she knew. She threw her suitcase on the floor, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes. But rest didn't come. The following days were a blur. She cried until she had no more tears left. She avoided social media, but the news found her anyway. And then the final blow came. On her phone, a notification. Eduardo Albuquerque and his new girlfriend, Bianca Vasconcelos, are seen together at a gala event. Clara felt her stomach churn. Her fingers trembled as she swiped the screen. There they were, smiling, as if nothing had happened, as if she had never existed. A flood of messages flooded her phone. Friends asking if she was okay. Acquaintances shocked by how quickly Eduardo had replaced her. But the only message that made her stop was Eduardo's. "Clara, I'm sorry. You must have seen the news. But I think it was for the best. I'm happy, and I want you to be happy too." The absurdity of those words hit her like a punch. Happy? After everything he had done. He simply moved on and expected her to do the same? Clara stared at her phone screen for long minutes. And then something inside her changed. The pain was still there, but for the first time, she realized that she no longer wanted to live that way. If Eduardo could move on so easily, why couldn't she? That night, Clara opened her laptop and began searching for a new destination, a place where no one knew her, where she could start over without the shadows of the past. That was how she found a small coastal town forgotten by time, a simple place without the hustle and bustle of the big city, without memories of Eduardo. Without thinking twice, she bought a ticket. This time, she was the one leaving everything behind. The sun was rising when Clara got off the bus, pulling her suitcase along the hot asphalt. The city was peaceful, without chaotic traffic, without rushing. The smell of the sea invaded her lungs, like a promise of something new. She took a deep breath and looked around. No one there knew who she was. And that was exactly what she needed. The warmth of the sun was still gentle when Clara walked through the cobblestone streets of that small coastal town. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance and the smell of the sea were a stark contrast to the life she had left behind. Here, no one knew her. No one knew of her pain, her betrayal, the hole that Eduardo had left in her chest. She pulled her suitcase slowly, observing the simple and colorful houses, some with flower-filled balconies and half-open doors. The residents seemed to lead a quiet life, greeting each other by name, smiling at strangers. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. After walking for a few minutes, Clara stopped in front of the inn she had booked for the first few weeks. It was a small place, made of aged wood, but welcoming. A sign hanging at the entrance read, Posada do Seu Antonio, home for those who need to rest. Before she could ring the bell, the door opened. An elderly man, with kind eyes and a sincere smile, looked at her curiously. You must be the girl from the big city. Welcome. He extended his hand, firm but welcoming. My name is Antonio. Clara. She shook his hand, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled effortlessly. Mr. Antonio guided her inside, showing her the simple hallways and the small dining room, where a rustic table was set with coffee and homemade cake. We don't get many visitors who come to stay for so long, but I hope you feel good here. She nodded, feeling tiredness take over. I hope so too. The room was small but cozy. The simple bed, a window with a view of the sea, and a wooden balcony that creaked under her steps. Clara dropped her suitcase on the floor and took a deep breath, feeling the fresh breeze touch her face. Freedom. In the first few days, she walked aimlessly through the city, trying to get used to the slower pace of that place. She discovered a charming bakery on the corner, where the smell of warm bread filled the air. She tried fresh fruit at the market, chatted with some shopkeepers, and felt that, for the first time in a long time, she was doing something for herself. But what caught her attention the most was a man who seemed to always be nearby. She noticed him for the first time in the bakery, sitting alone, leafing through a newspaper. Then she saw him at the market, picking apples as if he were distracted. He was always wearing a white t-shirt, unshaven, and had a lost look in his eyes. He wasn't nosy. He didn't try to make conversation. But for some reason, Clara's gaze met his too often for it to be a coincidence. She didn't know who he was, but she knew that, somehow, he also seemed to be there to escape from something. And, little did Clara know, destiny was about to cross their paths. Time passed slowly in that small town, as if each day were a break from the hectic life Clara used to lead. She got used to waking up early, feeling the sea breeze on her face, and having coffee at the bakery on the corner, where the smell of fresh bread and brewed coffee reminded her of simpler times. But something, or rather, someone, seemed to follow her steps. The mysterious man. She saw him almost every day, always at the same cafe, always at the same small bookstore downtown. He didn't approach her, but their gazes met more times than Clara could count. The first time, she thought it was just a coincidence. On the second day, she began to notice. On the third day, she knew there was something there. Until one rainy afternoon, chance decided to act. Clara was returning from the market when the first drops began to fall. She tried to hurry up, but the drizzle soon turned into a heavy rain, forcing her to run to a small bar to take shelter. The doorbell rang as she entered, and she shook her wet hair before realizing she was not alone. He was there, sitting in a discreet corner with a coffee in front of him and an open notebook on the table, scribbling something that seemed important. But as soon as their eyes met, he stopped writing. This time, he didn't look away. Clara hesitated for a second. She could ignore him and wait for the rain to stop, or she could finally find out who that man was. Without thinking much, she walked to the counter, ordered a coffee, and, on impulse, sat down at the table next to his. The silence stretched on for a few minutes. Only the sound of the rain and the aroma of coffee filled the room. Then he broke the silence. It seems the city likes to put us on the same path. Clara raised an eyebrow, surprised by his voice. Firm but calm. Or maybe it's you who shows up in the same place as I do. He laughed, closing his notebook and looking directly at her. Miguel, Clara, that simple exchange was enough to break the distance that had separated them for weeks. The minutes turned into a light, natural conversation. She learned that Miguel had moved to the city a few months ago, that he was also starting over, that he preferred rainy days to sunny ones, and that he loved books, which explained his frequent visits to the bookstore. And you? He asked, leaning in slightly. What brought you here? Clara hesitated. She didn't want to talk about Eduardo. She didn't want to remember. I needed a new beginning. Miguel didn't press. He just smiled slightly, as if he understood perfectly what she meant. The rain eased off, but neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. That night, Clara realized that for the first time in a long time, she had talked to someone without feeling pain. And maybe, just maybe, Miguel was part of the new beginning she had been searching for. While Clara was building a new life in the small coastal town, the past she was trying to leave behind was starting to crumble. And on the other side, Eduardo was about to discover that his choices had consequences. At first, his life seemed perfect. After the divorce, he gave himself over to parties, luxury events, and a new relationship with Bianca, the influencer who accompanied him everywhere. His nights were filled with drinking, having fun, and the pleasure of freedom. He didn't have to answer to anyone. But over time, this freedom began to show its true colors. True face. The parties weren't as fun anymore. The smiles around him seemed forced. Bianca's company, which had previously seemed light and spontaneous, now became demanding and superficial. He began to notice that when the spotlights went out, when the events ended, what was left was an uncomfortable silence, emptiness. And then the first signs began to appear. At first, it was just a persistent tiredness. Eduardo would wake up without energy, even after sleeping for hours. Then came the constant headaches, small twinges in his chest. He ignored them. He believed it was just stress. But one night, while he was at a crowded event, something changed. A sharp pain shot through his chest, strong enough to make him stop in the middle of a conversation. He put his hand to the spot, trying to hide it. Maybe it was just indigestion, a passing discomfort. He ordered another drink, forced a smile, and moved on. But the pain returned. In the following days, it was accompanied by a strange tightness in his breathing. His body felt heavy and tired. And for the first time in a long time, Eduardo felt forced to stop. When he finally went to see a doctor, he received a warning. He needed to change his habits immediately. But, as always, he ignored the warning. He continued with his disorderly life, pretending that everything was under control. Until, one morning, alone in his apartment, his body gave out. Everything around him spun. The floors seemed to disappear. The last sound he heard was the phone falling from his hand before everything went dark. Hours later, he opened his eyes in a hospital. The white lights on the ceiling made him blink a few times before realizing where he was. His heart raced. He tried to sit up, but a deep pain made him groan. It was only then that he realized the brutal reality. He was alone. In the first few days, a few messages arrived on his cell phone. Women he had been out with, friends from parties, all wishing him get well. But no one showed up. No visitors. No genuine concern. The women who had seemed so interested in him when everything was fine now disappeared after a few exchanges of messages. The friends from the parties went on with their lives. And for the first time, Eduardo faced the truth he had always ignored. He had no one. The emptiness that had once been just an annoyance became an open wound. And for the first time since it all began, a name crossed his mind. Clara. She would have stayed by his side. She would have held his hand, asked how he was. She would have worried. But he lost her. He threw her away without thinking. And now perhaps it was too late. While Eduardo faced the weight of his choices, Clara was living a completely different moment. The days in the small town began to become a pleasant routine. Morning walks on the beach, coffee at the bakery, quiet afternoons at the bookstore. But above all, there was Miguel. He would show up unannounced, but always at the right time. Sometimes, just to greet her with a discreet smile at the bookstore. Other times, to sit at the same table at the bakery where they would talk about books, the city, and little things in everyday life. It was different from anything Clara had ever experienced. There was no rush, no demands. Just presence, company, and that was enough. Little by little, Miguel effortlessly became part of her life. At first, Clara tried to keep her distance, afraid of giving in and getting hurt again. But he never pressured her. He never asked for anything. And without realizing it, she started to let her guard down. Until, one late afternoon, something unexpected happened. The two of them were walking along the beach, the sun tinting the sky orange and gold. Miguel kicked the sand absent-mindedly, while Clara watched the waves gently crashing. You know, I thought I would never be able to trust anyone again, Clara confessed, without looking at him. Miguel stopped and was silent for a few seconds. Then he sighed. I understand. She turned her face to look at him. You've been hurt too, right? He smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. Yes. And for a long time, I thought I needed to close myself off from the world. But I've learned that not everyone will treat us the same way as those who hurt us. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to believe those words. And, looking into his eyes, she realized that she did. And then, without either of them planning it, it happened. Miguel held her hand. That was all. A simple gesture, but it made Clara's heart race. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel the weight of the past. Only peace. And in that moment, she knew she didn't need to run away anymore. The following days were full of little moments that made Clara realize something she never imagined. She was happy. Not because someone completed her, but because, finally, she was whole. But then came a surprise. That morning, Clara felt an uneasiness that didn't seem normal. At first, she thought it was something temporary. But as the days went by, something started to change. Awakening in her mind. Her body was different. Time had passed without her noticing. And, for the first time, the delay became evident. With trembling hands, Clara bought a drugstore test. She returned to the inn, closed the bedroom door, and took a deep breath before taking the test. The minutes seemed eternal. When she finally looked at the result, the world spun. Positive. Clara sat on the bed, pressing her fingers against her lips, trying to process what this meant. She was pregnant. Her heart beat too fast. Fear, joy, uncertainty, all at the same time. What would Miguel say? And in the back of her mind, an unwanted memory appeared. Eduardo. Her eyes filled with tears. This time, it wasn't about him. It wasn't about the past. It was about the future. And she didn't know if she was ready for it. Clara sat there, sitting on the bed, holding the pregnancy test, as if it had the power to change everything. And in a way it did. A part of her wanted to smile, wanted to believe that this was a new beginning, a blessing. But another part the one that still carried scars from the past, felt afraid. She and Miguel had only been together for a short time. Everything between them was light, natural, without pressure. And now, everything would change. What would happen if he thought it was too soon? If he didn't want this responsibility? She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She tried to push away the bad thoughts. But she didn't have time. The sound of the door opening brought her back to reality. Clara. She looked up and saw Miguel standing there with a worried expression. Is everything okay? You disappeared earlier today. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but the words simply wouldn't come out. Miguel frowned and took a step forward. What is it? She looked at the pregnancy test in her hand. There was no hiding it anymore. On impulse, she held out to him. Miguel took the object carefully, and when his eyes landed on the result, Clara held her breath. The silence stretched for seconds that seemed like hours. And then, to her surprise, he smiled. Are you happy with this? Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her body. I'm scared, but yes. Miguel laughed and brought one of his hands to her face. Then that's all that matters. I've never been happier. Clara collapsed into his arms, allowing herself to believe that this time everything would work out. But the past never disappears so easily. Miles away, Eduardo stared at his cell phone screen, feeling increasingly restless. Ever since he left the hospital, something had been eating him up inside. An emptiness that not even he could explain. No parties, no luxury, no women seemed to fill what was missing. And then, on impulse, he searched for Clara on social media. Nothing. No updates. No new photos. No trace of where she was or what she was doing. This began to bother him in a way he couldn't explain. What was she doing? How was she living? Without thinking, he sent a message to a mutual acquaintance. I need to know where Clara is. The reply came a few hours later. She moved to a small coastal town. She's fine. Eduardo's heart raced. He typed another message. Which city? On the other end, Clara had no idea that her past was about to knock on her door, and that Eduardo was on his way to find out everything. The wind blew gently through the small coastal town as Clara and Miguel walked along the beach at dusk. The cool sand under her feet and the sound of the waves crashing gave her a sense of peace she had never experienced before. She looked at Miguel and smiled. His gaze carried tenderness, protection. She had found a love that didn't make her feel small, that didn't force her to beg for attention. For the first time, she felt whole. But in the meantime, Eduardo was just a few kilometers away. When she got off the bus that took him to the city, her eyes scanned the quiet streets. Everything there seemed frozen in time. There were no luxurious buildings, no trendy parties, nor the temptations that had led him to lose everything. The silence of the place was almost torturous. Why had Clara chosen to live like this? He never imagined she could adapt to such a simple life. Clara had always liked the big city, the good restaurants, the fancy trips, or at least that's what he thought. And now, for the first time, Eduardo realized that maybe he had never really met the woman he had spent so many years with. His mind was buzzing with doubts, but he had to find her. And then he saw her. Clara was on the beach, barefoot, the wind messing up her hair. She was laughing at something another man had said, a man who wasn't him. Eduardo felt his stomach churn. His chest tightened in a way he couldn't explain. She kept going, but the final blow came seconds later. His eyes dropped to Clara's dress, which outlined her silhouette in a way that made her look like a different. The sparkle in her eyes, the careful gestures, the hand resting on her belly. Clara was pregnant. His heart raced. His breath caught. He didn't know what hurt more, the fact that she had a new love, or the fact that she was building a family, something he had never given her. For a moment, Eduardo thought about going over there. calling her by her name, forcing himself to believe that she still felt something for him. But what if she didn't? He stood there just watching, and when he saw Clara slide her hand over her belly tenderly, something inside him collapsed. Clara was happy, truly happy, and he finally realized that he was no longer part of her life. Eduardo never imagined that seeing Clara move on would be so painful. But deep down, he knew he deserved every second of that pain. Eduardo remained there, standing on the sand, as if time had frozen. His eyes were fixed on Clara, but this time there was no more anger, no more pride, no more desire to reverse the past. There was only regret. For the first time, he saw the stark truth. Clara was no longer his. She hadn't just moved on. She had blossomed without him, and that hurt more than any betrayal he could have felt. With a heavy heart, Eduardo turned away. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could change what had already been done. But before he left, he knew he had to do one last thing. The next morning, he walked to the small bookstore in town. The place was simple, cozy, with wooden shelves filled with old books. He bought some paper and a pen and sat down on a bench near the beach. He took a deep breath before beginning to write. Clara, I don't know if you want to read this, but I needed to write it. I spent years living as if happiness would always come at the next party, the next trip, the next woman. But the truth is that nothing was ever enough. And now I see that the only thing that really mattered, I threw away. I got a shock when I saw that you were pregnant. Not because it hurt me, but because it made me realize that life went on for you, while I stayed in the same place. I'm not going to ask you for anything. I'm not going to tell you that I love you and that I want to get back together. Not because it's not true, but because now I understand that I've lost that right. I just want you to know that I'm happy for you, that I hope your son grows up surrounded by love, affection, and presence, and that you have everything that I never knew how to give you. Goodbye, Eduardo. He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and walked to the bookstore. The clerk looked at him curiously when he said, "Can you give this to Clara? Tell her you don't have to answer." And then, without waiting for anything else, Eduardo left. He didn't try to see her again. He didn't try to reopen wounds. This time, he chose to set her free. That afternoon, Clara found the envelope on the counter of the bookstore. When she recognized Eduardo's handwriting, she felt a chill in her stomach. For a moment, she hesitated to open it. Did she want to relive all that? But then she took a deep breath and read every word. When she finished, she felt something inside her click into place. Eduardo, for the first time, wasn't trying to manipulate her, wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. He was just letting her go. And that was what she needed to say goodbye to the past. Clara looked up at the beach, where Miguel was walking towards her, and she knew, with all the certainty in the world, that she was no longer a broken woman. She was a whole woman, happy, and for the first time, the future had never looked so promising.